Stuff. So
Thank
I'll
you.
pass around and up to
This
Anand.
was a very interesting read, and I felt like as I was reading through it, it felt like yeah, it describes sort of how I uh, sort of the new emerging media, so to speak, to make its point, like all this chat transcripts that we keep sharing around. It seems to describe that culture uh, uh, pretty well, and it's quite on point. And I also like this sort of definition, I think, or like, or at least a way of describing hypographs as a class of writing that helps you to sort of basically search and retrieve the orthographs that he calls it, like orthographs from memory, which is the old conventional sort of um, artifact, I suppose, of like what you see is what you get type of artifacts. That's what I think orthograph mean in this context. It kind of uses hypergraph as a portal for orthograph, which I thought was also interesting. Um, uh, I was also like sort of trying to look at examples of hypergraphic media, and yeah, collective calls in some sense occurred to me as that, right? Like, so we have calls, we have audio transcript, and sometimes gets pushed through as an artifact with a newsletter or something. So that's to me seems like an graphic media. So that was an interesting example, way more contextual. The other one I was thinking maybe it's incomplete. Like I was thinking names, the human names itself as some sort of like a uh, an hypographic artifact, perhaps I don't know. But I was thinking like if you think of the names, like it could mean like it's basically a prompt to think about the decision making and the sort of the cultural orientation that went into naming a human in a certain way, perhaps retrieve a certain orthograph from from that. I don't know. I don't know if that makes sense, but I was thinking about human names as perhaps as like another an example. Uh, uh, yeah, I'll I'll stop there. I'll pass it down to Anuraj.
Yeah, so really interesting article. So I think a few, I think last week or before that, I had read a tweet. Somebody was tweeting that a lot of humans would like forget or would not be literate at all, and it seems like this is already happening in some of the languages, like the actual people don't know the actual like letters and words, but they are just like kind of predicting it. And like it also reminds me, like, because like when I was young, used to be really good at spellings, but these days I'm really bad. So I basically type something, I know what I want to type, but like the spell check basically gives me the correct spelling. So that is how and that has eroded my like spelling, so I don't actually remember anything. And basically uh, like this also affects like how we program, or like software in general, right? Because right now like how we build software is basically it goes through an intermediate language kind of layer, and then it actually goes to the bits, and like how the bits are manipulated. So there is an intermediate layer how we manipulate the bits. And I think a few weeks ago Elon Musk was tweeting that like eventually all programming, the text based programming would like disappear, and there would be like training weights, and then the weights would be used to basically manipulate the bit. So that was something interesting. And I think like Alan Kay also like mentions similar to this. Like I have seen a talk like in which he mentions that like uh, the initial he shows like a initial graph GUI development, and then like somebody used to manipulate the components of the GUI, and then they would like directly be like you could manipulate the GUI elements directly without actually like the text based programming behind. I don't know how much of that was like actually established, but like he is a regularly laments about that we never reached that level of like programming. Right now, even if you use GUIs, like behind the scenes it's all text based. uh, yeah, those were some initial thoughts. Passing on to Jenna.
Yeah. First, I guess it's just, yeah, like this is one of those things where it seems useful to have a word, a catch-all word for all of that stuff. So that's fun. Um, and then I asked Claude about this. It really should be Untertext. It feels like the kind of thing the Germans should have come up with. But Claude informs me that Untertext is not a word yet, and that the Mulaney piece is not yet translated into English. I also have been aware for a long time of my own degrading English handwriting. I'm not the first one to notice that, but it hadn't, I don't know why, but it hadn't really occurred to me to wonder what's happening to Chinese. I've only rarely been able to watch, I have had a chance to watch Chinese people using their keyboards, and it's is kind of just a mind blower, like how much harder it is what the demands are. Although I don't know, hard isn't probably the right word, right? Like once they're good at it, is it any more difficult than me mashing away, fat fingering on my own keyboard? So I don't know about that. Um, uh, the there's another thread for me about this general sense that only gets bigger with every passing day, which is there is no possible way I could read everything I might want to read, and all this AI leveraged writing. For the moment, it's just part of a mushroom cloud, and all these pieces that I should be interested in, but when they're there, there's the piece, and then there's the piece about how I wrote the piece using my buddy Chapity or Claude. I can hardly bring myself to read any of them right now because it's just like I don't yet have a good filter or intuition about which ones are going to be worth the work. And so instead, I just like, okay, it's one of those, and I move on. So that's a current dilemma. The other thing that I asked my friend Claude about was I've been aware for a long time of my own felt sense where the work that an artist may do to come up with the painting is often more interesting than the final output. And so I asked whether, this piece specifically has to do with writing, but there's that whole field of the in-process stuff that is actually always been really interesting to me, as opposed to just looking at the final output. I think those were my big threads. So passing down now to Nathan. Hey, Nathan.
Hey, I am actually really surprised that nobody has brought up Darmok and Jalad. Because when I was reading this, like that was the first thing I started thinking of was like this is totally Darmok and Jalad into Agra territory. Like that feels like the end game. Like you kind of it's pointers to things, not the thing itself. Um, suddenly it's the finger that's important, not the moon, sort of thing. Or you only refer to the finger, even though you mean the moon. To mix my movie metaphors very badly. Um, but yeah, that was something that came into my mind is that sort of metaphorical language and language that points. And I think that Anant's comment about names, names are also we don't tend to think of them that way, but names are also in many languages are pointers to stories or particular things in history or something. I mean, at some point somebody just made up some set of sounds to be a name, but it seems that nowadays people tend to be named because it's pointing at something. Um, I think there definitely did feel like a lot of legs to this idea, and I think it's notable that like um, I was reading this and I kept thinking like, oh, this is a little bit like Git or Wikipedia, and then about halfway through, the author is like, so this is a little bit like Git or Wikipedia, which like I thought was sort of a strength. Like it definitely feels like it's picking up on something because of this. Um, Something else I feel like feels adjacent to this, and I've seen a lot of people talk about this now, but I'm going to reference. I'm not sure how many people follow um, John Stokes' writing, um, but on Substack, and I can drop a couple links. So unfortunately, a lot of it's paywalled. But Stokes, I feel like at least for me, was somebody who started writing about like how to use LLMs to do real work at a functional level, like not a sort of a vibe code thing, but like how do you actually make this happen? And articulating this idea a lot better and a lot more deeply than other people were at the time. Though now I've seen more people come up with sort of the same ideas, and so I'm not sure if Stokes was like the first, or Stokes was just the first I read, or sort of how in there. But part of the idea was that of this building up of artifacts and actually committing artifacts to your Git repository as you were doing this. But the artifacts were not necessarily code artifacts. The artifacts were descriptive artifacts. And so building up a description of the software, and then you were designing, and then breaking that down into little actionable chunks, and actually using the LLM along this way to do all of this, and then creating this commit history of that, so that if you did turn out to be going down sort of the wrong search path, you could back up in that and sort of then refork a new branch. And that creates that's something that I've started to wonder, and I've forwarded this idea to a few friends, and they've all been very skeptical about it. But I've also run in very AI skeptical circles, so I'd be curious what everybody else take here. Is that I've kind of wondered if like one of the end results of LLMs getting really incorporated into a lot of things is that we're going to wind up with much better documentation, that a lot of processes that were sort of like social and implicit, or documentation that was sort of like out of date, but you just had to know the guy to talk to, like that's all going to have to become regularized so that these tools can do their work. And it's going to become regularized probably in like plain text. To a certain extent, like that is a little bit like, like all this bureaucratic ease kind of also becomes sort of a hypographic media, because it becomes this sort of input, but it's also referenceable input to it. So it feels like there's some world where people figure out how to write these sort of raw inputs and structure these raw inputs, and that could be theoretically packaged up. Maybe it's too big to actually package, but you can kind of imagine that package along with a set of outputs, whether those outputs are programs or laws or whatever, and that bundle sort of provides sort of that media thing. But it feels like there is this sort of missing step, is that there's a lot of implicit knowledge that goes into all of that, and sort of making that part of culture machine readable. And I think machine readable here really does mean like plain text. Like that's kind of like, I feel like almost like the missing step here. I am not much of a developer. I'm going to throw out an idea here, and I'm going to pass on, because I really want somebody to actually build this. Is that, and I think this plugs into this, is that you can imagine something like it feels like what's being described here is some combination of sort of like Wikipedia talk pages and Rome linking and Git histories all mashed up. And we have all of these technologies, and you could imagine like some set of like Rome like blocks as like markdown files that can only be one line, like memes, and then you can connect them up with schemes that are these JSON files, and then you can track all of this in Git so that you can cut versions of it. And you can imagine these JSON files including not only node structure and allowing you to embed things like Rome does, but also including things like chat and like history and development of things. And then all of this allowing us to edit this down and selectively disclose or not disclose. You can imagine like selectively encrypting markdown blocks, for example, with GPT or something. Somebody go build this, make it an open standard, but I will pay you for the application. I'm just going to say that. And now I will pass down to Sachin.
Yeah, this was really interesting to read. Um, yeah, I guess one thing I was thinking about was with respect to like day-to-day work. It almost feels like hypographs have become more important than like orthograph outputs. Like if you take let's say managing people, I feel like a lot of it just happens on Telegram or like Discord or Slack now versus reading like a PRD or like the yeah, if you have a product like and um, something like a product requirement doc does not matter that much. What the whole thing sort of happens in it's sort of like a flow versus stock thing. Like it happens in Slack or Telegram, and then maybe somebody builds a prototype using Cursor. Um, the orthograph outputs don't seem that much or seem to be less important in just, I guess, knowledge work in general. The other thing was, and I think this probably requires further thinking, but the like I was wondering, like if you take like religious traditions, there's the Protestant sola scriptura, which is like only by the script, basically. The Bible, like the script of the Bible is what matters. And while like if you take like the Quran or the Talmud, like the interpretation, basically there's like a big culture around interpretation of those scriptures, right? And so uh, is that like hypograph versus orthograph? I'm not sure, but I feel like there is something there where one is sort of like a living tradition, like basically it has to be updated and interpreted, and that has as much importance as the scripture, while the other one is more like Christianity. Post Protestants is more like the scripture is the truth type of thing. Yeah. And I guess there's also and yeah, the Darmok reference made me think. I recently saw that episode. It sort of reminded me of how like most like epic poems sort of make references to like classical references, like to some sort of mythology, and it's sort of used as like a stand-in for, like, it's sort of given that you understand what that classical reference means. It's almost like shorthand for what is happening in the story. Like I was reading Dante's Hell, like the first part of Divine Comedy, and basically a lot of that is him. A lot of the poems are just him referring, like him putting his contemporaries in older like myths, and you're sort of supposed to understand the classical references he used, but since I don't, like, there's like a good interpretation at the end of each chapter that sort of goes and says this is what he's referring to and blah blah blah. So I feel like the classical like epic poems and stuff had a lot of sort of like this hypograph tradition in some way. But anyway, those are my thoughts. Passing it back to Ankit.
Yeah, lots of interesting thoughts here. And yeah, I think there's a bunch of threads here that are worth pursuing. Markdown is one of them, I think. Like, I have a friend, some of you know Dorian Taylor. He has strong views that Markdown is a bad idea because it's kind of like ambiguous and not structured enough to do, semantic web type stuff. So he prefers things like XML, XSLT, RDF, those much more rigorous ways of like doing structured data. But Markdown, I think the reason it's becoming popular as I guess you could call it like an intermediate representation between human and computer layers of compiling symbolic texts is um, there's some vague part of us that thinks that even if computers vanished and all we had was paper printouts of Markdown, we'd be able to understand that as opposed to fully compiled into binary or even things like HTML or other markup languages that are much more alien looking because they're partly for the computer. So Markdown is, maybe we can think of Markdown as the language of hypographic mediums. And the more we kind of expose the Markdown level of presentation and connect it up socially. So I think the key thing that that's hard to think about, to your point, Nathan, about the Darmok angle. So I think what this article is getting at that's not captured in Darmok is within the Tamaranian society, the Darmok way of talking is actually full-blown social communication, right? Because everybody knows the shared mythology. So when I say, Shaka when the walls fell or whatever that kind of phrase is, I'm not using that phrase as a key to retrieve a story from the computer and then sharing that story with the other person. I'm directly retrieving the story from the other Tamaranians' organic memory. So, right? So it's a communication modality. So it becomes like proper media. And the reason it fails, of course, when the Tamaranian is trying to talk to Picard is Picard does not have those shared historical memories. And at one point, I remember reading an essay claiming that Chinese is actually a little bit like Tamaranian because not only are so this is even before like considering things like typing Chinese on a typewriter, like just regular Chinese is kind of like Tamaranian because it's an ideographic language, which means each of the symbols has kind of a history of why it represents the thing it does, and much more so than any other language, being able to interpret that symbol and also efficiently mapping its nearest neighbors and saying this is a symbol for a tree and that's the reason this other symbol is a symbol for a forest. I'm making this up, so Jenna probably knows better than me what an example would be. But the whole structure of the Chinese language relies on personal memory of in a way the cultural history of China, not at the deep level of Tamaranian, but it's not like you learn any other regular type of scripted language. You could, in principle, just learn the lettering and a bunch of vocabulary, and they'd be kind of black boxes to you, and you'd be functionally able to communicate. And the abstractions of Chinese logographs, I think, are much leakier, and so it is closer to Tamaranian. But I think what this particular angle is getting at is that the social angle is missing, and the individual angle is transient. So not only are you not using the hypographic strings to talk to each other, even the talking you're doing to the computer or other like mechanical retrieval system, that's completely transient and you throw it away. So there's something important there. Anyway, yeah, Markdown, the sociality and transience aspect, and a bunch of other things are occurring to me. So I'll show a screenshot of a thread Emmett Shear did that I think kind of gets at this about how LLMs are snapshots of like, overfit context intelligence in point in time. That's why they seem to get worse over time because the world shifts. So I think that's a related conversation. I'll post that.
This talk about the ambiguity of the language and like about in relation to Darmok. It also like depends on how precise we want to be, right? Like I think like some languages allow like more precision with less text. For example, if we want to write a legal contract in Darmok, it would be like a really long processed document, but like with something like an earth or an earth based language, you could like compress that and then reproduce it really well, right? So I think that's some relation there, like how much precision you want, and like, and this also affects, I think, like the societies that would get built depending on the like the communication form between the different participants in the society.
Going back to the markdown angle, I think there is some truth to the critiques of markdown in that it is, because it is that sort of the model. It's very. I do agree that like the reason it's sort of winning is that you can kind of as a human read markdown, and I think one reason why the most recent innovation of Markdown that seems to be catching on has been like sort of Obsidian style wiki links and image links. And I think one reason, and I've seen, and I'm saying catching on because I've seen, Obsidian sort of did it first, but I've now seen a lot of other Markdown editors start to adopt that, and it seems to like I can see it slowly becoming kind of a de facto new addition to the standard. Kind of like tables weren't in there originally, and it become kind of added in, and it feels like one reason for that is that it actually makes it more readable for humans, and so I think that is the big key, is that like Zenkai was saying, like you can read a market, civilization collapses, all you're left with is reams of printout of markdown. Like you can actually read that, whereas like HTML you can kind of read, but then you start to get much more past that. It becomes really, really difficult to sort of like get your head around like what's actually being said. Like this is one of the things I pulled all those JSON subtitles for our channel, and I was looking at those JSON files, and I'm like, I would be like, JSON is pretty readable, and I would be hard pressed to figure out what people were saying from these subtitle this particular type of subtitle file. But I do think, like, I mean, that critique is right. Like, and that's why, I was thinking, it's like, it feels like you need to combine it with something. Like, you need a layer that is both a human layer that you can kind of read independently, but then you need something that provides linking information. And, like, something like a Git tree provides temporal linking, like it gives you like the entire idea of version history, but you need something that provides like spatial relationships. And you can say, well, I can do that by like putting links in markdown files, but like that's something that it does feel like becomes very hard to maintain. And this might be just like, there may be like one of these like pick two here, like, human readable, I'm not really sure. Human readable, machine easily human readable, easily machine usable, or structured for machine, um, survives the apocalypse. I mean, I'm not quite sure what the three are, but it feels like there's a trilemma here somewhere. But I also think like in a trilemma, like a lot of people like they want elegance and whatnot, but it feels like the thing that lets people work with it in the most flexible way tends to be the side of the trilemma we get more weighted to. Like even if we're not like actually up against a boundary condition, like we're closer to that side. And I think like to a certain extent, Markdown is superior to HTML because it is easier for people to work with. And, we've already seen some people trying to build, that we're in the infancy of like write Markdown instead of HTML to make your website. And I've seen some people complain about that as like a step back, but I actually think it's probably a step forward with these things.
I want to just jump in. I believe it connects because in order to do anything with all of this stuff we're talking about, you have to be able to connect to the internet. And I'm having kind of an amazing experience this week. A client got me a Starlink Mini. You guys may know or may not, but it's only been out, I guess, about 6 months. So I'm talking to you right now through this little plastic box sitting in my dash while at a campground on the coast of Maine. And the connection, the throughput is better than almost anything I've ever had. So I don't want to get blasé about it too quickly, that this little plastic box is talking to a satellite, this, and that it's both amazing, but also essentially, I assume, fragile. I could make Elon mad or Starlink mad, and they would cut me off with a simple click. So it's all still really fragile. But right now, this week, it's just kind of gobstopping. What's that? Gobstopping? Is that the word? It's kind of amazing moment in a traveler's life. Back to the group.
Thing that I could have mentioned in my original thinking was I think the Princeton professor that the article cites as like he evaluates dialogues that the students have with the LLM as opposed to just the output. That seems like both prescient and important going forward in like how you sort of analyze even learning outcomes, right? Like that, especially in the context of the Emmett Shear's thread, it seems like if the world is shifting underneath, it's like how you interrogate it becomes more important in this sort of hypergraphic world, perhaps. So
Yeah, I recommend reading the Emmett Shear thread for everybody and loading it up into your LLM and asking for it to be unpacked. I think it's a very important idea that LLMs basically overfit language data very strongly, and it happens to work out because of this particular unique aspect of linguistically encoded intelligence. And that's why LLMs get stupider over time. So there's something very deep going on there that's very related to this. I think I think Nathan's prompt is a good thing to think about, like what's the underlying trilemma here. I post one candidate in the chat, but there's like the reason symbolic intelligence is not necessarily infinitely valuable to preserve, which is why when people do that, it starts to be an arbitrary religion, is because there's something about when you put intelligence in symbolic form, like in a language, it automatically acquires an expiry date. So LLMs particularly bring it out, but I think it's sharply true even in purely human paper book writing. So you write a paper book, maybe you even handwrite it. You cannot assume that this is going to be infinitely preservable or valuable, and therefore it induces a dilemma. And I think hypergraphic media really force the constraints of that the expiry date strongly on us. So there's something interesting going on here. Intelligence has an expiry date would be my short version. Anyway, a few more minutes left. Any more thoughts?
Venkat, regarding that, so much of, like, I've been listening to Natalie Haynes talk about what we know about the Odyssey, the Greek gods and stuff from the writings, and that often it comes down to one tiny little shard that survived all the years. So when you say that something's not worth keeping around, it feels like there's no way to know what shard would end up being useful 1,000, 5,000, 10,000 years from now. You have any quick thoughts about this sort of the what little we know about ancient history and how precarious all that was.
Yeah, the other book I've been recommending all summer, the Elizabeth Eisenstein book on the impact of print, that kind of gets into that. So I think the two dimensions here are in sort of like a social truth sense. We make the pragmatic assumption that stuff is more valuable in proportion to how much it survives. So we kind of almost make a Darwinian argument about evolutionary adaptation being a proxy for truth, right? Like, so you could argue that the fragments of ancient Greek texts that have survived are statistically likely to be the most valuable ones. So, for example, if you think of it like, thousands of copies of books were made, but the ones that were most valuable had the most copies and therefore had the most likely to survive. You could make a statistical argument that just evolutionary survivability kind of takes care of value in some direct way, and any human cultural sort of like value judgment and explicit preservation stuff is like conceits on top of that. So, which means in the current time, if you write something and it spreads a lot, that's your proxy for, yeah, there's a higher chance it'll survive. And then you can be agnostic to all the technical intentional things you do, like, right? Like, take the example of, say, somebody writing a blog post that they're very proud of, but nobody reads, nobody cares, nobody comments, but they are convinced that this is like the greatest thing anybody has ever thought or written. And then they go to a lot of trouble encoding it in like 100 different ways, putting it on IPFS, I don't know, carving it on a crystal and putting it on the moon. You could do everything you can possibly do to put text in the most preservable form so that it survives 100,000 years. That doesn't make it important. Like, it could still be completely lost, or maybe it's preserved and somebody finds it 100,000 years from now and retrieves it and says, why was this important? This looks like bullshit, and then forgets it again promptly, right? So there's something to be said for the Darwinian view of the long-term value of intelligence, and otherwise assuming that there's some sort of average half-life or time constant where on average a piece of symbolic intelligence is only worth X minutes in value, something like that. So that's my current view. I haven't yet thought it through.
The contrary episode was the only reason we know about Sappho is because one particular something or other survived. I wish I could remember exactly. But the selection process has deep biases, so it's a little tricky. Passing back.
I was going to take this a slightly different route, not thinking about selection biases, but going back to the idea that these things are sort of fixed in time. An LLM is trained at a time point, and so that creates a degradation as the world shifts under it. I think that comes out in a couple other ways. Like, one thing that Stokes really emphasizes is the one importance of keeping the artifact files is to guard against that. Is that we tend to there's this sort of implicit assumption that a lot of programmers make that may be the source of a lot of complaints about, like, oh, these things are getting dumber with time or something. And it's not even so much because, like, oh, the practice of programming has shifted significantly over the last couple of years. It hasn't. But because we sort of like are implicitly assuming that anything that sort of like acts like a human is learning. And these things aren't actually learning if we're, the learning is actually the artifacts we provide along the way. And so when you sort of stop, you tend to just gradually stop providing the additional context, because, like, if you were talking to a human, you would stop providing that additional context. You'd be like, oh, they know the story now. I don't need to tell them the story again. But that's not true for these things. And I think that's sort of like the big failure mode that I think culturally maybe we have to wrestle with. And that's like the specific, like, use case of like using these for writing or for programming or something where, you know, these, yeah, the ground is shifting underneath you, but the ground shifts, you know, is generally measured in years or decades. So using the same model repeatedly, you're not going to see like between one day and another or one even month and another some like significant degradation unless you're sort of assuming that the model is learning when it's not actually. But then longer term, this, you know, this is one thing that does suggest like all software, like one of the fallacies I ran into a lot when I was like on sort of the IT side of things and not on the red team side of things was that people just sort of assume that you can buy a system and then it just like works. Like they're like, oh, it's like, you know, it's like a hammer. I'm going to buy a computer and it just like works for a while. And nobody thinks like that these things have to be maintained and updated and that the ground is shifting. And I feel like this is something we're going to run into even more strongly with LLMs. Like the training never stops. Like even if the improvements and abilities plateau, you will still have to continually retrain these things because the culture is shifting underneath you. And the values are shifting underneath you. And what you think is important is shifting underneath you. And what you want to remember is shifting underneath you. And so you can't just have eventually GPT Omega. Like you never get there. Even if GPT Omega plus Delta is not actually an improvement in ability, you need to keep doing that retraining to maintain relevancy. It's just maybe that retraining becomes longer periods, but that depends upon what your periods or like your cultural horizons are. So I don't know.
All right, we're a couple of minutes over. So good discussion, everybody. And yeah, I think this suggests a lot of interesting lines of thought we should uncover. So if you find interesting essays unpacking this stuff more, please share in the CADS channel and we'll schedule them. I think next week is back to Anuraj's Ethereum track. Okay. See you guys.